I've always been fascinated by the history of films, the way stories evolve, shifting, reshaping through the script writing process. There's something really cool about discovering a film that I like was almost something completely different, or even that one single change in direction could have altered it. And when you examine a film that's already regarded as a masterpiece, or something at least close to that, you begin to understand how it all came to be. A character's backstory, a subtle plot shift, even the smallest narrative tweak could be the difference between obscurity and legend, especially in horror. And more importantly, these changes can often dictate a film's commercial success, which would cement its place in history. Which brings us to Wes Craven's 1984 horror classic A Nightmare on Elm Street. What began as a relatively low-budget indie project, released after his already brilliant horror film The Hills Have Eyes, unexpectedly morphed into something far greater than some indie horror film. It became a monster of its own making, a cinematic nightmare that refused to be contained. With sequel after sequel, people just couldn't get enough of it. Freddy Krueger's design said to be altered from the very original conception, the ending imagined to be darker than what we've really seen. These are all crucial shifts that didn't just shape the film. You could say they carved its path toward horror immortality, because without them, Freddy might never have become the nightmare-inducing icon we know today, standing proudly on the Mount Rushmore of horror villains. And then you have Robert Englund, who had film experience leading up to this role. Eventually, Freddy Krueger rolled around and redefined his career through his brilliance as a performer and Craven's eye for making effective and lasting horror villains. Alongside Craven, Robert Englund sculpted Freddy into something more than just some slasher. They turned him into a symbol, a grotesque manifestation of fear, of loss of innocence, of the fragile boundary between reality and the darkest depths of our nightmares. And through their vision, Freddy became eternal, and A Nightmare on Elm Street became more than just a film. It became legend. Robert Englund opened up about how he channeled parts of Freddy through Klaus Kinski's Nosferatu and other monsters created by the great Lon Chaney. Also notorious for Krueger was how his legs always stood slightly separated, which he attributed to James Cagney, as this pose signified sheer power. Psychology also notes this as a way to assert dominance. Due to the heaviness of Robert Englund's Freddy claw, his shoulder at times was in a slouched position, though he quite liked this result as he always thought he was reminiscent of a cowboy drawing a gun. I always believed Robert Englund was a king with the way he moved in character as Freddy Krueger. Lead actress Heather Langenkamp, when first reading the script at the audition, didn't get the memo of it being a horror film, even saying it read more like a John Hughes film, quoting, "With all these mischievous teenagers." Boy, I was wrong.
Yep. I said it before and I'll say it again. Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
It's said that there are numerous different elements from Craven's childhood which inspired parts of the inner small details of the film. But in regard to the actual plot, he confirmed the film was inspired by several newspaper articles printed in the Los Angeles Times in the 1970s about Hmong refugees who, after fleeing to the United States because of war and genocide in Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam, suffered disturbing nightmares and refused to sleep. It was a series of articles in the LA Times, 3 small articles about men from Southeast Asia who were from immigrant families and had died in the middle of nightmares. I think when you look at it as a film that's main job was to push off that bout of confidence that teenagers have of not being afraid on the outside, when in reality on the inside they're terrified. And through creative thinking and reasonably minimal budget, the film achieved exactly what it was hoping to. But you can't ignore the real-world inspiration that was tragic and director Wes Craven thought was important enough to inspire a film. But how does this lead us to the scary Freddy Krueger we all know and love? Well, it's said that on one night during Wes Craven's young life, he saw an elderly man walking on the sidewalk outside of his window. This encounter was enough to startle young Craven and was held onto until the day he eventually used it as inspiration for a character he deemed a perfect fit. And the name Freddy was, funnily enough, a petty move because it was a nudge to his childhood school bully, Fred Krueger. Explaining Krueger's ethos, Craven stated, "In a sense, Freddy stands for the worst of parenthood and adulthood, the dirty old man, the nasty father, and the adult who wants children to die rather than help them prosper. He's the boogeyman, that evil, twisted, perverted father figure that wants to destroy and is able to get them at their most vulnerable moment," which explains why the dream reality became how the horror plays out. Because in this era we had Jasons and Michaels and Leatherfaces, and the one thing they all had in common was they all wore a mask. Craven didn't want your typical mask killer. He wanted a face that could take nasty shape, could be haunting, when you see how happy this killer is to kill, and smile in situations you don't smile in, giving Freddy that 100% ability to taunt with the freeing expression. There's a really cool story about how hard it was for them to sell this film. Wes Craven had reportedly approached many different production companies in regards to making the film, but he just seemed to get no after no after no. It was when Universal Studios shot them down, calling the film not interesting enough. Wes Craven framed the rejection letter in his office. One of the best horror movies ever released to some people was deemed as not interesting enough, which plays back on how you always say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
I'm starting to dream with my eyes open. I can't tell what's real anymore. I haven't slept in 3 days. If I sleep, I dream. If I dream, I'm dead.
There are different reasons anyone could tell you why the remake in 2010 didn't work, nor satisfy any itch to see Freddy Krueger again on screen. And it doesn't even really boil down to Robert Englund not portraying Freddy, but it's also a thing of respect. Wes Craven wasn't consulted and ultimately hated the idea of the remake even happening. When we spoke earlier about all the companies which rejected Craven's screenplay, eventually he took a deal with New Line Cinema, a deal he didn't want to make. Craven mentioned how when he signed the deal, he had to give up all rights to the franchise, and therefore he had no say in the remake. And looking at it from his perspective, it's the film he loves the most, which also made the most money, and the film which was sent around Hollywood for 3 years with nobody wanting anything to do with it. The film he spent his life savings on, he had no choice but to take the deal. So when New Line Cinema set up a reboot that entirely cut him out of it, I'd likely be as upset as he was. There's a segment of a documentary I've seen of Wes's that I loved, and it was about what inspired him as a writer of film and of poetry. It was a place of great torment himself. In college, he developed a deadly form of paralysis, which almost killed him, but when he came close to death, he focused in on writing poetry, which obviously in the future would extend into film. But it's this brilliant start of a career which defined horror as we know it, because horror films are poetry. That came from a place where it's as true as it could be, staring out the window of life, knowing it really is as fragile as our elders taught us it was. That's as real as it gets, and I believe he had the greatest fortitude to use that as a motivator for reasons only he knows, but we all have the graceful opportunity to look back on it and take from it what we can. Half a film is what they did, and the rest is how we interpret it, and stories like this are just what builds my appreciation for his work and what he's done for horror as a whole. Because if I'm looking at it from the right angle, I feel compelled to see the landscapes he's built as like a poetic arena of masterclass, everlasting fiction, which seems like a push in a genre that was so closely associated with the nasty, perverted side of humanity that's shown in film. Only now it's this bountiful leap that's what inspired everything that's widely accepted in our life today. And we see how grossly media is similar. These stories are like an exemplary bridge between society or fear and imagination, and where it transcends to an unfortunate actual reality. But its reflection on real life is nothing if not clear and true. In my last video, I talked about Wes Craven's inspiration for making The Hills Have Eyes. These films come from real places with real problems and real stories in the real world, and he was an advocate for what was right and seemingly very vocal about what was wrong with the world. And for so many reasons, I believe Wes Craven was one of the most brilliant directors, and I still find myself learning more about him as time goes on. These films of his will always be among, if not at the top of the greatest horror films ever made, and they clearly age so beautifully.